What you're about to listen to is as close as I could come to making what is known as an op-ed. Now, that's a little bit of a loaded term because an op-ed is technically a newspaper-only thing. An op-ed literally is shorthand for opposite the editorial page. This was the term given to opinion pieces when they were first introduced to newspapers all the way back in the 1920s, I believe beginning with the New York Times. Opinionated pieces tended to be frowned upon within journalism, but obviously they are now a big part of journalism, and it is kind of important that I denote that this is an opinion piece due to the nature of the content of this video. That being said, I am not a journalist. I am just some guy with a YouTube channel who has a bit of a soapbox he wants to go on because this topic has been bugging him for years. Now, this is not a topic that is necessarily original. This is not new. In fact, I'm sure you've heard this discussed many times in the past, although probably with increasing irregularity as people get tired of espousing the same virtue over and over again because nobody freaking listens. And I'm not about to expect to change any hearts and minds today. I just want to put this out there as a reflection of my own thoughts and opinions on the matter so that people know where I'm coming from, and I can always reference this video if they're ever confused about anything, but also because I do want to sort of draw a line in the sand in this regard, as I feel like there is a gross and grave misunderstanding as to the term review and how it works. So I'm not going to name this video anything authoritative. This is not going to be a declaration of any kind, but it is pretty strong in as far as opinions go, and it is definitely directed towards a certain subset of people. If you don't think that the things I'm talking about today apply to you, then it probably doesn't, but it does apply to a chunk of people who may or may not even be watching this video, but I know they're out there because I see these same people go absolutely ballistic constantly every single time a big thing is released, and this is especially prevalent within the game community, which is why I want to focus on that side today. So, over the past couple of months, we've had a series of interesting situations that I think highlight the evergreen controversy gamers take part in over reviews and, more importantly, journalism itself and what the point of it all is. The three subjects I want to highlight in particular in regards to this topic are the Super Mario Bros. Movie, Redfall, and The Legend of Zelda: Tears of the Kingdom. Now, with the first two, I explicitly want to highlight the reactions to the reviews with those games. With Tears of the Kingdom, I was originally only going to address the Kotaku situation, but then the Gfinity review happened. That horrible, awful review that dared to give an infallible masterpiece like Tears of the Kingdom a 6 out of 10, because yeah, I got some things to say about that. Firstly, I want to go over what a review actually is, because a lot of people think it is essentially an extension of the marketing and PR department for a product. And it isn't. I can see how some people are confused about that, though, when PR firms do use reviews as a part of their marketing. But it's the other way around, actually. Reviews that heap praise make for good sound bites and taglines, but they are not working for a publisher. Even Game Informer, the mag literally owned by a video game retailer, isn't that morally corrupt. I mean, sure, when talking about early looks and previews for a game, criticism is almost non-existent, but that's not what those are for. In fact, I'm going to break down the three most common types of gaming journalism for you so you can understand the differences. A 20-page piece on an upcoming game or a preview is just that. It is a preview. It is an opinion piece set within a very tightly controlled and curated environment made up by the publisher themselves, showing the person that is doing the spread only what they want them to see. The game this person is playing for this article is not fully representative of the final product, but it is representative of what the publisher wants the public to see. That is why these articles are full of hype and very little, if any, criticism whatsoever. They are kind of outside of the journalist's control, and they must play within the ecosystem that the publisher has set up for them, otherwise it's not happening at all. Then we have reporting. Reporting is just that, the word, reporting. This is an objective fact occasionally laced with conjecture that is meant to lay out the realities of a situation per the knowledge of the person writing it. This is incredibly cut and dry. A journalist learns information about something either firsthand or through a trusted source. They cite the nature of that source if applicable, and they lay out the information for a reader. How the fuck reporting is ever controversial is a mystery to every sane person in the world, because this is fundamentally the most important thing journalism can do and is meant for. This is why why we as a public need and rely on journalism to spread the word and to keep people informed. And this is why freedom of the press is so important. Because if reporting is obstructed or messed with because somebody doesn't like it, society suffers, plain and simple. Can there be missing context and nuance to reporting? Absolutely. Can reporting also be shoddy and full of biases and therefore terrible? Also, absolutely. But that is why being reactionary is frankly stupid, childish, and overall terrible for your personal mental health. Now let's talk reviews. Reviews are, flat out, opinion pieces. I know it's wild to some people because reviews aren't actually tagged as opinion or op-ed like I tried to do at the beginning of this video, but by definition, a review is subjective in every context. Listen, if you get a performance review at a job, you are being rated based on your performance at the job at the discretion and opinion of your higher up. They don't have an imaginary color-coded grading scale based on the amount of times you've overperformed or finished a project by the deadline or anything of the sort. There is somebody taking a look at your work and deciding whether or not you should be rewarded, disciplined, or something in between for said work. Now we move to entertainment and media. A movie or music album or TV show or video game review is just that. It is the opinion of the author, of the discerning party, the person sitting down and partaking in this piece of media and telling us what they think of it. There's no imaginary scale of objectivity they can pull from to weigh each criticism against because it doesn't exist. To go back to the performance review analogy, if your boss negatively rated you for showing up late to work 5 times in a month, you can't ask him to cut you some slack because another business nearby you used to work at would let you be late with more leniency. That doesn't fly. So when a video game reviewer says that maybe they don't like the gameplay in a video game but you happen to love it, does that make the reviewer dog shit? Does that make them an idiot? And why would you ever use this reviewer ever again? No, none of these things are true. Absolutely none of them. Your opinion of video games is not the correct one. It's not right. There's no such thing as the right opinion in this world, no matter how many likes on Twitter you get for it. In fact, that very thinking is actually quite dangerous. It's that rigidity in thinking, that fundamental narcissism that forms the basis, that forms habits of radicalization and extremism. That belief that your worldview is the only one is deeply concerning at best, and if you go far along enough with it, you become, by definition, eventually a sociopath. So first of all, the reason reviews and reviewers exist at all is because these people are better at putting into words the way they feel about something than you are, the unemployed one. That doesn't make them right, they are just better at articulating the opinions, and that's why they have the reach and the clout. That's it. We aren't supposed to judge reviewers by how much we like them and their opinions. That's like fundamentally missing the point of the exercise. So we're going to start by talking about the Super Mario Bros. Movie and the reviews that came with it, although very briefly, because this was sort of the start of the troubling discourse that I saw in this trifecta of a shit show. Now, I'm not about to individually defend any one review on the film other than to say that they have a right to their opinion. I saw a couple where the writing was questionable, certainly, but that doesn't make their opinion incorrect. What I am going to say, however, is that the reactions to some of these reviews were, well, let's just say some people are very content to deep-throat the boot these days, and I'll never understand that level of passion for a brand. Look, personally, I thought the movie was fine. As a vector for nostalgia and a place for longtime fans to spot references and get excited over visuals and moments replicated from their childhood, and to finally see something we all grew up with represented on screen, it is a great time. But as a film, as a written and animated and directed and acted upon work of fiction. Seriously. And you have to understand that that's where these reviewers are coming from. These reviewers did not geek out like you did when you saw all the references in Mario's bedroom. They probably didn't even recognize Kid Icarus or don't even know what that is. They didn't squeal like you did when Gusty Garden started playing. They didn't absolutely lose their minds at the Wrecking Crew reference because none of those things had an effect on the quality of the movie, nor did they likely enhance their experience in any way. They aren't judging the film on the merits that you value because they aren't you. The collective tantrum thrown by gamers when the reviews dropped was, and frankly, always is, disgusting. But it was amplified due to the crossover into another industry this time, and the fact that it's always fucking Nintendo fans, because I know for a fact Sonic fans didn't piss and moan about nearly as much over the critical response to those films. Be passionate. Go see it if you love it. But do not dare assume that your opinion is mightier than another's, and if you really think it is and that you can do better, Go do it. Go build your portfolio, write your reviews, and grow an audience. Become another voice by articulating it and being better. Don't just be another NPC commenting, "Fuck IGN, this is why they suck," before clicking on their Jedi Survivor gameplay preview and commenting on your excitement for it like 30 seconds later, you freak. Now we turn our attention to Redfall. And yes, this is very much related, because here we see the exact opposite response, with a sense of irony that I find just delicious. Granted, I will say, this being on a different console and having nothing to do with Nintendo, this is largely a different subset of gamers, but there's always some overlap, and in some instances, this does apply to the exact same people. Redfall was and has been a disaster. There's no two ways about it. Microsoft's latest big exclusive launched in a broken state on top of having fundamentally broken mechanics, and by the standards of a billion-dollar corporation exclusive is concerned, it got torn to shreds by reviewers. Yet the tone this time was relatively mild, almost grateful, and in fact praiseworthy of most reviewers, because as a collective, they took this game to the cleaners with their opinions. There were warnings regarding its bad design on top of its poor performance, how realistically nobody should be buying it. The number of critics even recommending gamers try it is sitting at a meager 14% on OpenCritic at the time of writing. And now that the consensus was reached, the line was towed. That the masses were appeased, suddenly we see the praise. This is why we have reviews. This is the job of a reviewer, to warn us when a bad game is coming so we don't waste our money. In fact, scorn and shame are to be heaped on the few reviewers that did like the game. How dare they? Idiot must have been paid off by Bethesda and Microsoft, right? You see the juxtaposition here? You can't have all these things simultaneously, by the way. Every one of these reactions directly contradicts each other. Even if you agree with the sentiments, reviewers cannot be wrong while also being there for our benefit, while also being paid shills, while also being fanboys who love one corporation while hating another. That's just not how reality works. General consensus is just that. General. It's an overall approximation of most feelings on a certain subject within a given space. And that's the other thing, too. Where you see these sentiments does matter, and I'm fully aware that this even applies to what I'm saying here. That I, too, am saying all this in the general direction of a subset of gamers that I have seen on exactly 3 social media sites and nowhere else: YouTube, Twitter, and Reddit. But that is kind of the point. If this inane bullshit that I'm telling you is inane and bullshit does in fact apply to your line of thinking, then that's that. And when that group is large enough, when it's one of the 42,000 or more people who liked this tweet about how it's a good thing to blacklist Kotaku, then you should probably listen up. Because even if you seriously believe that, even if you absolutely loathe Kotaku as a publication and hate everything they've ever written, there is a big problem with that line of thinking. Now, far be it from me to ever defend Kotaku directly, as I do very much dislike their style of journalism. They are incredibly provocative, very click-oriented, and extremely fast and loose with what they deem to be well-written when it comes to the quality of their articles. The only time when I genuinely paid attention to their work was when Jason Schreier was reporting for them years ago, and he was and still is kind of a bona fide legend in that department as far as the game industry is concerned. His track record is quite possibly the best this industry has ever had, and he is an invaluable resource no matter your personal feelings on the guy. His work has been keeping this industry in check for a long time, and when he departed Kotaku, I was quick to follow him for his work, as that's what I valued most about the site. That said, Kotaku still has an audience. It has a reach and it has a user base. Kotaku is still a resource for thousands and thousands of people who use them for information. That is a fact, not an opinion. They employ dozens of writers and generate more than enough clicks and ad revenue to pay these people. They are evidently controversial enough that their sphere of influence can piss off tens of thousands of loyalists by simply reporting on things from a leak, which is what they did. In a clearly spoiler-tagged article that users did not have to click on, they took some info from some footage of the game running on a hacked Switch, and they simply laid it out there for those who were curious, which is frankly harmless? But people lost their entire shit over it. You know, over this article nobody had to click on. And like, okay, whatever. People have the right to be upset over innocuous things, I guess. But it was this particular nugget that really drew my ire and sort of compelled me to talk about all of this in the first place. And that is people genuinely celebrating the notion that Nintendo has blacklisted Kotaku when Kotaku themselves had revealed that is the case and has been the case for some time. So, blacklisting. Honestly, it's really not a huge deal in the grand scheme of things unless you make it a big deal. Nobody is owed access to things. Access is a privilege. At the same time, no journalistic outlet should ever let the fear of losing access get in the way of doing their job and doing it well. Media outlets are not beholden to publishers, they just happen to report on their industry, and so they are usually required to come to some sort of mutual understanding to do their jobs respectively. The free press has a right, however, to not toe that line, and to do so for their own benefit as much as the benefit of their readers, which, that's all a journalistic outlet can ever do. Their only function is to aid one side or the other with the right messaging. For an example of a very valid blacklisting, Kotaku was once and has been blacklisted by Bethesda way back in 2015 for leaking the existence of Fallout 4 before Bethesda was ready to reveal it. Of course this pissed Bethesda off, and they had every right to do so, and you notice Kotaku doesn't really kick up that much of a stink about this one because they probably do understand that it's justified. However, the people who gained that knowledge and information early benefited from it. Being able to learn that another Fallout game was finally and truly confirmed to be on the way after so many years was not only exciting, but it was not revealed with all the hype mongering that publishers crave to get your pre-orders early, which is kind of a good thing. A sensible, realistic, and very factual reveal, and Kotaku took the bullet to give that to us, the merits of their other work notwithstanding. But even if you feel this is justified, the blacklist is still a bad thing because it means there is one less perspective from which the news and reporting on Bethesda's games comes from. There was one less voice in the crowd, one less possible chance someone might see things from a different angle that you might not agree with, but others certainly could. Nintendo blacklisting Kotaku cause articles bad does not benefit anyone. It doesn't even benefit Nintendo. In fact, you could argue that it does them more harm than good. I talked about that fear of losing access, which is a coin with two sides. Yes, certain outlets may be very cautious and careful and overly optimistic around the big N because of that fear, but once the access is gone, what more have they got to lose? What's going to stop Kotaku from absolutely lambasting Nintendo when they fuck up now that the fear has been ripped and torn from them? The little man babies on Twitter? Of course not. Kotaku doesn't have a need to care now, and all Nintendo has done is given one less voice a means of speaking before something is up. They can only do so once it has happened. That only hurts us, the gaming public. When corporations start to cut out those with the platform and the messaging, all that's left is their respective PR firms. If the only news we ever got from Nintendo games came from directs, and while I'm sure certain weirdos would love that, it would be extremely damaging to the health of the industry. There would be no accountability, no reason for Nintendo not to pull the wool over everyone's eyes every single time, and no reason to use anything but their own PR mouthpieces to benefit themselves. Take your lips off your favorite company's ass for just a moment and think about why these things exist. Step outside your own biases for a moment and realize the ramifications of this. Don't cheer when a publication is shut out. That's never a good thing, because I'll tell you with certainty that companies would love nothing more than to revoke access from everyone. They would love to make their line the only line, for their carefully curated messaging to be the only information you have. They would all love to be like GameStop and have their own game informers. We know this because of how many times it's happened. That aforementioned Bethesda and their refusal to send out any review codes ever again after Doom 2016. EA and their behind closed doors policy that they don't send out review copies to those who don't toe the Metacritic score line. Ubisoft and their post-launch embargoes with games like Assassin's Creed Unity. What was Nintendo and Sony's reasons for pulling out of E3 if not to carefully curate the message in pre-recorded presentations so they couldn't embarrass themselves on stage again? Blacklisting is what these companies want. A lack of accountability, more control. These benefit the corporation and harm the rest of us. I cannot fathom the notion that even in the case of a reviewer that I totally despise being walled out of the industry, that I would ever cheer for that. There are times where I understand it, sure. There are times when it's even completely justified, but celebrating it is just such a strange sort of self-own that makes no sense to me. But gamers have been conditioned over the years. A lot of people forget or don't even understand the point of journalism. They don't know why Polygon and IGN and Kotaku and Eurogamer and all these other outlets even exist. What's the point, right? And I think that's honestly scary. I think that fundamental misunderstanding, that uneducated outlook towards something like reviews that's made for our benefit, is looked like they're supposed to validate our feelings. Like they're supposed to make my opinion the right one or something because it's been put pen to paper. Because somebody agreed with me that this game is a 10 out of 10. Then I can sleep better that night knowing my brain is a good brain that is capable of properly discerning good from bad as if it were objective. While a disagreement is not only wrong, but an affront to my view of the world, that my perspective and the way I see things can possibly be challenged. How dare you, IGN, say that Alpha Sapphire has too much water in it? I love Pokemon Generation 3 with all my heart, and this singular criticism entirely invalidates your review. Not because it isn't even correct, but because it is far too silly to be a bullet point in the pros and cons of this otherwise well-reviewed video game. I do decree that you are a charlatan and a scoundrel, and say without question that I'll never return to your site until I click to the homepage and see that, oh wait, you gave Super Smash Bros. For Wii U a 9.8 out of 10 a few months later. Something IGN's not actually that half bad. I want to talk lastly about that Gfinity review, because it is, unfortunately, the latest target of gamers and their hypocritical ire. This frankly very reasonable and useful review that's being called clickbait and exists only to draw traffic to an otherwise unknown website, which, I mean, yeah, but only because the entitled narcissistic jackasses took it that way. This review could have gone largely ignored, only existing as it was meant to, providing a different perspective to an otherwise beloved and widely lauded video game. But instead, people had to go diving into the replies and comments and harass the author of the review into privating their account to get away from all the unwanted attention, because that's what it was. Unwanted. If they wanted your harassment, they never would have locked their account, people. Think on that for a second. Anyway, this review was indeed written from the perspective of somebody who didn't like Tears of the Kingdom's predecessor all that much. Now, this is a unique perspective because it's all too uncommon, but takes a lot of stones from a publication to do. I find it a massive shame that this isn't done more often, but the reasons why are because of something like Metacritic, where you only get one shot at a review, and that review is not representative of the writer on an aggregate site, but rather the entire outlet's feelings on the matter. When you employ multiple writers on your staff and give only one of them the de facto voice, that's a lot of pressure. So the willingness to extend that olive branch, especially in this bizarro world we live in where people think reviews are meant to validate the opinions of the people who already pre-ordered the damn thing and were going to buy it anyways, is yeah. What I'm saying is Gfinity didn't do something clickbaity. They actually had some balls and catered to the crowd that the sycophants never think about. But mostly because they're not them. As if reviews aren't a buyer's guide meant to aid people. As if they aren't explicitly for people who are on the fence for a purchase. Which frankly, in the day and age of release games and patch them later, as well as blatantly false advertising from game publishers, everyone should be on the fence to start with, but that's a conversation for another day. And some people will point to the 6 at the bottom of the review and say, well, that's the problem. None of this would matter if the number wasn't there or if it didn't affect the Metascore, which, like, okay, I heard that last bit a little bit, and barring the utterly insanity and the bootlicking implied in that part of the statement, let's go over the first half of it. Scores are only a problem because of things like Metacritic. Because Metacritic has its own set of rules on how games should be rated, and it grandfathers every single review outlet into its rating system because it is an aggregate. The scores themselves are not the problem because a number means different things to everyone. The problem is that the most popular scoring systems dictate public perception. IGN, for instance, is notorious for rating games very highly as a baseline, almost never doling out anything below a 7 for anything that's generally considered above average, and Metacritic follows this pretty closely. You notice how they color their scores differently between movies and games. For games, anything below a 75 gets a yellow outline, which by Metacritic standards is roughly average. Anything below a 50 gets the red treatment, which is outright bad. Now, is that the same scale that Destructoid or VGC or Eurogamer uses? Is that the same scale Gfinity uses? You don't know because you didn't read the Gfinity review. You just saw the yellow score on Metacritic and got mad about it. And that isn't Gfinity's fault. They are not obligated to score games the way Metacritic wants them to, lest we forget that Metacritic works almost entirely on an out of 100 scale, completely butchering the nuance in reviews that dare to review out of 10, out of 5, or heck, even out of 4. And also not considering the wide variation in opinions on what constitutes a perfect score. Some people do believe that a 10 out of 10 should only ever be given to a perfect video game, or a near perfect video game, while others may be more lenient in that regard. If IGN scores a game 10 out of 10 because they had a very few issues with it, but you, the viewer, say that makes no sense because they did in fact have some issues with the game, does that make IGN wrong? And let's take that same game and find a review outlet that reviews games on a 5-star scale. They could make the exact same points as IGN, but due to the fact that they had some issues with the game, they might not be as lenient on their grading scale, which means they give the game 4 stars. Well, Metacritic sees that, and suddenly now that score is an 80 out of 100, which in comparison to IGN's 100 out of 100 looks extremely harsh, and everyone dogpiles on that review, comparing it to IGN's because this score makes no sense. But it does. It really does if you step outside the Metacritic bubble for 2 seconds and realize that it doesn't work. It's not a sound or functional system. It's completely arbitrary, and yet legions of gamers and people within the industry treat it like it is the end-all be-all, which is... it's a massive problem. It destroys the discussions we can even have around reviews before they begin. But let's pretend that the whole score and rating discourse doesn't exist for a moment and look at Gfinity's review a little more closely, because I find this to be a very helpful review, actually. Especially as someone who, myself, didn't actually gel with Breath of the Wild all that much. Yes, me. I'm the kind of person this review is for, believe it or not, and I know I'm not alone in that. Despite the overwhelmingly loud contingent of fans shouting down any dissenters for the past 6 years, there are some of us who don't much care for the 2017 take on The Legend of Zelda. To briefly summarize why, I don't much care for sandbox games in general. I'm very ADHD and need structure to not feel aimless in most things, let alone video games. I found Breath of the Wild's seemingly limitless freedom quite overwhelming and frankly difficult to follow along with, to the point where I got bored about 10 hours into the experience because I felt as though I was just doing things for the sake of doing them. I found the stuff I was supposed to be doing to engage with the plot to be the least interesting aspects of the entire game, and I also didn't like the controls very much. The combat was pretty rigid, at least on its own, and required constant creativity to actually make it worthwhile, which was an often unsustainable expectation. If I were to give it a score, I'd probably give it a 6 out of 10, which in my mind means that the game is above average, but not quite good, because were I a review outlet, I would make 5 out of 10 my median, not 7 out of 10 like IGN tends to. But I don't think Metacritic would appreciate that too much. You see how this all kind of ties in? Anyway, with that context, let's talk about the Gfinity review. Now, this review is quick to make the point that if you are not a fan of Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom may not necessarily pull you in either. Literally within the first couple of paragraphs, and I'm going to quote it directly. Just as its predecessor came to ring in the new era, this year's in the making sequel is currently looking like Nintendo's fond farewell to the system that pulled it out of the stinking pit of the Wii U era. But how do you follow up on what many believe to be one of the greatest games of all time? That depends on your view of what came before, and Aonuma's team has done it time and time again with Majora's Mask, The Wind Waker, and Twilight Princess. Skyward Sword rocked the boat before Breath of the Wild righted the ship, for some. Yet, if you're one of those brave enough to admit that the open-world adventure leaned more on the problematic Wii Zelda era than the GameCube and N64 golden days, there's a high chance this long-anticipated sequel will be less of a dream walk into the sacred realm and more of a swift descent into the dark world. Now, obviously, there are a lot of fluffy words in there, but we get the gist. I think calling people who dared to admit they don't care for the first game brave is a bit obtuse, but certainly not entirely unfounded, given the all-too common reaction to that sentiment from the more fanatical Zelda diehards. The author then begins by saying that the world is largely the same this time around, with a few key characters and things moved around, which isn't necessarily a criticism, but a statement of vague fact, as of course, any review has to be very wary of spoilers. We can assess this portion as possibly being dismissive of the changes, but that is conjecture. Again, without going into spoilers, we can't know for sure what is new that the author had a problem with, and I'm sure he has to tiptoe around it very carefully, regardless of his thoughts on the matter. The very next thing this review goes on to criticize is the dungeon design, which, if I remember correctly, was actually a very common bugbear even amongst many of the diehard Breath of the Wild fans, and how the divine beasts made for some of the least interesting challenges in the entire game. The writer goes on to say that the dungeons this time around are not really any better. He states, "Mere days before release, a poorly worded or translated tweet referencing an interview-style discussion with the developers convinced hundreds of thousands that dungeons were larger than that of the last game. They're not. In raw surface area, maybe, but in terms of length and complexity, no. And that's heartbreaking. Dungeons in Tears of the Kingdom fall much closer to the condensed approach of Breath of the Wild's divine beasts. They may be titled like traditional dungeons, but walk through their doors and you'll be met with the find X number of doohickeys objective that can easily be completed in under an hour without much thought." He goes on to mention how some of the new powers factor into the puzzle design and how, rather than make the player have to be more creative to figure out the solution, they simply give players way too many solutions from which to choose from. Now, this is framed as a negative by the author, and that is his right and his opinion. Believe it or not, again, let's go back to the context I gave you here. I actually find this notion compelling, because I do not like lock and key puzzle design. The fact that a puzzle can be solved in multiple ways is intriguing to me, but see, I never would have gotten that nuance had I not read this part, and I'm not so unable to parse information from what's framed as a negative to see something that is, to me, a positive. This is how you're supposed to read a review, by the way. You don't have to agree and disagree with everything written in here to understand where the author is coming from and to get useful information. However, there are aspects of this review I do agree with further down the article that are just as useful to me. For instance, under a subheading called Too Much Work, Too Little Reward, the author states the following. There's frankly too much going on, with no real prizes for bothering to seek out the opportunities. The world doesn't feel barren per se, but the rewards for exploring it are virtually non-existent or largely inconsequential. Some of my fondest memories of the Zelda franchise stem from exploring not only to satisfy my own curiosity, but to find game-changing gear, heart containers, new powers and combat techniques, rupees, or even just a bottle for storing potions and bugs. A surprise fight with a dragon is always appreciated, but when the reward is just another shrine, my enthusiasm to explore takes a nosedive. Which, I mean, yeah, I absolutely feel the same way. I remember feeling that way in Breath of the Wild. While shrines were a means of progression and that doing them was building towards more hearts and a better stamina bar, the sheer amount of the things, only to see that I had checked off basically a percentage of an upgrade each and every time, and that I was at best rewarded with a weapon or shield that wouldn't even last me more than the amount of time that it took to acquire unless I actively avoided using said reward, was extremely disheartening for me. And that did discourage me from engaging with what was frankly a core system of the game. To hear that this particular criticism I had of Breath of the Wild is not addressed in the sequel is once again useful information for me. And especially when I'm trying to trawl through the absolute deluge of positive reviews that also say that certain aspects of the previous game are not addressed without taking the time to go over those points, then Gfinity is the only one here that's actually done me a service. Now, hopefully that was an extensive enough breakdown of this review to actually provide context. It obviously wasn't the entire thing, and that review isn't the entire point of this video anyway, but it's extremely useful as an example of everything I've talked about up to this point. It's one review, one opinion, and I'm going to tackle the obvious rebuttals here before I make my closing statements. Firstly, I don't necessarily agree with that review. Guess what? I haven't played Tears of the Kingdom. Even if I played it and I loved it, everything I just said would still apply. Loving it does not preclude me from finding this review useful in certain aspects. Secondly, this does not mean that I think this is even an extremely well-written review. I don't think the Gfinity Tears of the Kingdom review is a paragon and holds the rest of games journalism to account and sets a standard. It is a fairly simple, innocuous review that does what a review should, nothing more. Thirdly, not every review is perfect nor exempt from criticism. I have seen many a poorly worded review out there, and I encourage people that think that they can do better to do better. I said before that the only reason journalistic outlets have more clout than any average gamer is simply the platform and the ability with which they may articulate their opinion. If you think you can do better, do it. Prove everyone wrong, please. To go back to my point about the Kotaku blacklist, the more voices we have, the better. A diversity in opinions is only ever a good thing. We need more representatives of opinion, not less. And if you disagree with that point, you are inadvertently denying the existence of every single negative review of every video game you have ever loved. You are saying to me that all of your favorite video games have never had one single negative review written about them because the diversity in opinion was not there and therefore not needed. Because your favorite game was only given the same positive praise across the board, which you and I both know is a lie. To deny a range of criticisms to any piece of art is to equally deny it any praise. The very notion of praise can only exist because criticism exists to juxtapose it and vice versa. You cannot have one without the other. You know what I think? I think that the real problem with video game reviews is the vice grip that they have on the discourse of a video game around its launch. Honestly, everything about the launch of a video game is toxic. From pre-order culture to hot takes on social media, down to this notion that day one is the only day that matters for a video game, and after that, who cares? This obsession with immediacy is genuinely dangerous to healthy games discussion, and the very ideas of reviews is so wrapped up in that hostility that gamers themselves have been ruining reviews for multiple console generations now. Since the late 2000s at least, because gamers have such a low tolerance for dissent that not only do they attack people who dislike something they love, but they might be even nastier to people who love something they hate, which is just, it's pure insanity. The anger and the vitriol, the fanatical passion and fervor with which people treat a damn article and an arbitrary number on an aggregate site. It's truly psychotic. If you're a child who engages in this kind of behavior, I hope you will grow up and achieve a healthier mindset someday. If you are an adult, however, and you are part of the crowd that believes reviews are meant to be validation of your worldview, that other people's reviews exist to propagate your impassioned opinions and should only be a part of your echo chamber, that you are righteous in your anger and harassment and indignation over a review score, and that you should be allowed to lose your mind over these things, well, let's just say I am deeply ashamed to engage in the same hobby as you. Do better, educate yourself, and open your mind before it implodes upon itself. I want to end this by saying that I am not anti-consumer. I am extremely pro-consumer, and I am in fact very anti-publisher. I do not like the bigwigs of the gaming industry. The whole point of this entire thing is quite the opposite of what you think it is. I'm not out here defending reviews. I'm not even out here defending publications. I'm not out here defending games or games publishers. I do not give a crap about any of that in the context of this video. The whole point of this is to stop people from putting their foot in their mouth, okay? Because here's the thing about being pro-consumer. If you want to be pro-consumer, you therefore also have to give consumers a leg to stand on. When consumers are insane and wacko and completely lose their minds over seemingly innocuous things such as this, when they go to bat to defend corporations over something as simple as a video game review, what leg do they have to stand on when the entitlement debate gets flipped around? They don't. And that's what I'm saying. Y'all need to be better, okay? Y'all need to actually have some nuance, have some wisdom, speak with intelligence, think about the things you're about to say before they come out of your mouth, and maybe, just maybe, you won't be treated like a petulant child. Because unfortunately, that's how way too many gamers behave. That word right there, in fact, gamers. I try not to use that word often in conversation anymore. I try not to use it much in my videos these days anymore because I can only associate that word with an extremely negative connotation. I know a lot of people will put it in quotes or say gamers TM or things along those lines. No, just that word, gamers, I don't like. By the very broad definition, I am a gamer. We are all gamers. Everybody who plays video games is a gamer, but I hate that term because of what it implies. It is almost entirely looped back around to being obsessed with video games at the expense of oneself, which makes it a derogatory term when used in that context, and that's kind of what it is. This ridiculous amount of self-sabotage that I see come out of this community, and I know that you can absolutely boil it down to certain voices, at least 42,000 of them, but still a small subset of the audience, because technically the amount of gamers out there numbers quite possibly in the billions. There are so many, and to just boil it down to the people that I see on social media maybe isn't fair. But I know they're out there. I know there's a ton of them, and my reach here is much more likely to find them than more of the people that this video does not apply to, because that's just how it is in this circle that we're all existing in together. But the problem is that as concentrated as this group might be, this is also the group that has the loudest voice on things like social media, where a lot of the PR department actually sees this stuff firsthand. You see those articles that seem like nothing burgers at first, where they talk about harassment and all sorts of death threats and things being sent to people who work for game companies. That comes from this same circle. As small as it may be, as much of a subset of the gaming community as it may be, it's still there. That same subset that manages to go so overboard that they can piss off an entire collective of developers and publishers to where they get completely shut out. That destroys this hobby on a regular basis for the rest of us because of how just vile they behave. And obviously there are tons of other topics I could touch upon that encompass that entire group, that entire subset of people. But this is just the first one I wanted to get out of the way. Just talking about reviews, because I even feel like a lot of people who aren't insane maniacs don't understand how reviews work. There are a lot of people who are generally pretty level-headed that still get really confused when they see an IGN review and they go, that score's not consistent, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Or they look at Metacritic and they go, well, that number's big and that number's small, so that first game must be good and that second game must be bad. I mean, there's a lot of people who are just as innocently unaware, but the vitriol in this video was not directed towards you. This was just me being a little bit sassy because I just get absolutely sick and tired of those people, the people that I'm talking about, the ones who deserve the negative attention. But for the rest of you, this is still supposed to just be informative. I mean, I really don't want to come off as just a dick for this entire video to anybody but the dicks themselves. They are the ones who deserve the ire. They are the ones who deserve the scorn. They're the ones who need a talking to. They need to be told. And maybe I don't have a big enough platform for that, but heck, I made this video and hopefully it's enough for somebody out there. Ladies and gentlemen, that's going to be it for this one. Thank you all so very much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.